If you lit up your own. If you're lit up, your microphone's on.
My face and my work the whole drive down, so I didn't really start paying attention.
Good. That's better for me.
Requested by my friend and colleague, your Senator Tom Killian. Drafting legislation in Harrisburg, some significant input from the community. This input is especially needed when it involves a situation like this. We've been able to pass and enact some meaningful legislation last session on similar topics, but there's no doubt in our mind that more must be done. And so I think it's our hope that this roundtable and that all of you who have agreed to speak today will help us in preparing for those next steps. What happened in February was tragic. Similar situations have happened across Pennsylvania, across the country. That's why we're here today. We've assembled a team of state lawmakers, state and local law enforcement, advocacy groups, members of the family, members of the community to help us address this issue. Once again, I want to thank all of the panelists on behalf of the Senate Majority Policy Committee who have met with us today. Now I turn the rest of the hearing over to my friend Senator Killian. Tom, the gavel is yours.
Thank you, Dave, and I really appreciate Senator Arler for taking the time to travel here to Delaware County for this hearing. And I especially want to thank Dean Aikman's family, Roseanne and Rich DeRosa, and Chris Aikman for being here as well, and also Chris Demko, who also suffered a tragedy. We all know you suffered greatly when your loved ones were taken by a drunk driver. It means so much to us that you were here to share your stories and provide insight. I only wish this was under better circumstances. On February 16th, something that is unimaginable to most people happened. Dina and Chris Aikman were struck in a violent crash by a drunk driver while on their way home from a family event. Dina's life was taken that night by someone who had previously been convicted, not one, not two, not three, not four, but 5 DUIs. This night, the driver received his 6th DUI. Not long after that, I met with Roseanne, Rich, and Chris to hear what their family experienced and get some suggestions on how we can make the laws here in Pennsylvania better. I was joined with Greg Rowe from the District Attorney's Office and from the District Attorney's Association and our Delaware County District Attorney, Kat Copeland, at that meeting. And it was during that meeting we realized that although we have made, as David mentioned, we've made some progress in the laws. We had a major laws changed last year. We've still a lot more to do. I also know how deeply Deanna's death affected our community. Countless friends and family members waited for hours at bitter cold to pay their last respects at our memorial service. She was absolutely beloved by so many people. Since this accident, everyone has been asking the same questions. How could this have happened? How could someone who had already had 5 DUIs once again get behind the wheel while intoxicated and end someone's life? And what can we do to prevent this from happening again? It's my hope that we can answer some of these questions today and that we incorporate some of the ideas we discussed into Deanna's law, which I introduced earlier this spring. Where we are now is we have a co-sponsorship memo out and we're drafting the language. The purpose of this hearing today and this roundtable is to get further input as we clarify that language so that we can work to prevent a tragedy like that from happening again. Before we begin the roundtable discussion, I would first maybe start at the end and have everybody introduce themselves.
My name's Chris Demko. I'm one of the co-founders of Pennsylvania Parents Against Impaired Driving. My daughter was killed almost 5 years ago by a repeat DUI offender who was drunk and high on heroin, and my daughter was 18 years old at the time.
My name is Deborah Diadona, and I'm a victim service specialist with Mothers Against Drunk Driving.
I'm Rich DeRosa. I'm Dina's dad.
I'm Roseanne DeRosa, Dina's mom.
Senator Tom Killian.
Dave Argel, the district that I represent is in Schuylkill and Berks County.
Joshua Paul, Committee Executive Director.
Jim Hennigan, I'm a lieutenant with the Pennsylvania State Police, and I'm the station commander at the Troop K Media Station.
I'm Katya Copeland. I'm the District Attorney of Delaware County.
I'm Greg Rowe, the Director of Legislation and Policy for the District Attorneys Association.
Good morning, Nolan Ritchie, Executive Director for the Senate Transportation Committee, Office of Senator Kim Ward.
Good afternoon. Good morning, Tracy Plunkett, Representative Stephen Barrar's office.
Thank you. Before we begin talking specifics with all the folks we have up here, I think it's really important that we hear from Dina Aikman's family as well as Chris Demko. These are the folks that suffered the tragedy and are reaching out to try to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. And that's our purpose here today, to draft language that we can pass, get through the legislative process in Harrisburg, to tighten up our laws so this does not happen to happen to other families here in Pennsylvania. I would like to first turn it over to Dina Aikman's family.
I would like to thank all of you for your attendance here today to propose Dina's law. A special thank you to Senator Tom Killian and Shannon Royer for making this a priority, and to Kat Copeland from the DA's office for her support. Dina was
Take your time, no rush.
Sorry. Dina was a 45-year-old woman whose life was tragically taken far too soon. For a tiny girl, her heart was enormous and filled with compassion for others. Dina was a beautiful, gentle-hearted, loving person. Her smile was contagious and her laugh brightened a room. She touched the hearts of many. On the day of her funeral, 1,000 people stood in line in the freezing cold for hours to pay tribute to a person they would never see again. On February 16, 2019, only minutes from their home, Chris and Dina were struck head-on by a 5-time DUI drunk driver. Dina died in her husband's arms as he was yelling for help for his wife of 17 years. Chris's physical injuries were a broken pelvis and fractured ribs. He had surgery and is still not able to perform all the daily tasks he used to do with ease. The mental anguish is the horrific nightmare he witnessed that night, which plays over and over in his mind. Dina's preventable death has left Chris without a wife, us without a daughter, and my children without a sister. Her untimely death has devastated family and friends. I gave each of you a picture of Dina's funeral card, her face filled with love of life, also a picture of the demolished car that she was trapped in for hours and died. Why in hell would a 5-time DUI offender be on the road when all of his previous arrests were the highest blood alcohol levels and multiple charges of reckless driving? Unfortunately, a Delaware County judge ran David Strohauer's sentence concurrent instead of consecutive, and the DA agreed to it. Also, the parole board released him early on good behavior. Sounds like a comedy of errors that turned into a tragedy. If David Strohauer had a gun and shot my daughter that night, there would be no question that he would be charged with murder. He used his vehicle as a weapon to achieve the same purpose. I also gave you a copy of a law in Texas that under certain circumstances, a vehicle is classified as a weapon when it causes death. Because of these decisions, my husband and I are a member of a club we never wanted to join. We would choose to never be in this club, but now we can never leave. We are the club of grieving parents. Chris has lost his other half, the love of his life, the one he can never replace. The grief we all experience is unbearable. We carry it always. It follows us always. Every event, every single thing requires more effort and energy because we carry the additional burden of death and loss. The anger, the pain, especially the senselessness of this tragedy is almost impossible to comprehend. A mother's grief is a torturous life sentence that no one wants to live. It's bargaining for a different ending over and over again. I'm left with a math equation that never equates. No matter how many times I count, my children never add up to 3. One is always missing. David Strohauer destroyed our family, and the criminal justice system failed us miserably. Our DUI laws must change. Dina wasn't the first to lose her life, and unfortunately, she won't be the last. Do not think for one moment that you are more powerful than God, that this could never happen to you. I never, ever thought it would happen to us. Thank you. Rich.
When this tragedy happened, I learned that David Strohauer had 5 prior DUIs. I started to look into his past history. I looked into the DUI laws, both prior to the changes and the present laws. I think the laws are pretty good. MAD has done a fairly good job having the laws in the condition that they are, but like anything else, they could be tweaked. Mm-hmm. But in going through his record, I pulled his docket sheets, and in my mind, it seems that the enforcement of those laws is where the issue is. In this case, it appears to be a tragedy of errors, to play on my wife's words. So I'm going to give you a couple of things that I found, and you can take these as suggestions for changes that you want to make. So the first thing is that it takes a really long time between the person's arrest and when they're sentenced. Examples. It took 6 months to sentence him for his first racing arrest, 6 months to sentence him for his first driving while suspended, 5 months for his first DUI, 9 months for the second DUI. In fact, he committed his second DUI while he was just finishing parole for the first. It was 3 years for the third DUI and 2 years and 8 months after the fourth, 5 months after the fifth. There's no excuse for that delay. Many of the charges against him were either withdrawn or dismissed, I assume to gain a guilty plea. So therefore, he wasn't punished for some of the offenses that he committed. And some were actually reduced from the highest rate of alcohol to the lowest rate. I can't explain how that happened. Either our equipment that tells you he rated the highest rate is accurate or it isn't. Let's get to sentencing. In the sentencing, the minimums are always the same. 1 to 3, 1 to 5, whatever the sentence happens to be. I think the minimums should increase incrementally with each repetitive offense. 1 to 5, 2 to 5, however you can do that to increase the minimums. Concurrent sentencing. In my mind, that's a free ticket for one of the offenses. The sentences should always run consecutive. License suspensions are good, but the reality is that they don't work. A guy like him drives anyway. Ignition locks are a good idea, but when you got a guy like David Strohauer with his father, he just buys him another car. So that proved nothing. Let's get to parole. The past history of the offender should be a major factor in deciding the parole. Obviously, a person with 5 DUIs has a really consistent recidivism problem. And that's an indication of that person's potential behavior in society. So consider classifying repeat DUI offenders as violent. And the reason I'm saying that is that the parole board, when they evaluate a person for parole, he's a nonviolent offender if it's DUI. Nonviolent offenders require only 1 parole board member and 1 parole hearing member. Actually, the parole hearing member is the one that makes the decision, not the parole board, which we all think is the way it happens. So for a DUI offender, a repeat DUI offender, he should be classed as violent for purposes of parole, so that more than 1 parole board decider participates in the decision. And as my wife said, a drunk driver with a car is just as risky as a guy with a gun. I won't get into the qualifications for parole board members, although I can if you want to discuss it. But what I can tell you is they are supposed to consider the person's past behavior. I've been told that they only consider the person's behavior in prison. But that's not true, or it's not supposed to be true. So all these suggestions above only make a difference after the violation has been committed. So all the laws that you can make, they're only a deterrent to an honest person. Addicts and narcissists like David Strohauer and his father, they don't recognize these deterrents. The real need is to stop the opportunity for drunk driving. So none of those problems are going to be solved by, politicians, lawmakers, or increased enforcement. The biggest solution in mitigating the DUI issue is going to be solved by engineers. Engineers are going to develop vehicle systems that passively detect the condition of the driver and prevent an impaired, that would be an intoxicated or a drug person, from operating the vehicle. Passive detection systems are already in development. MAD has been aware of this since 2008. There's also another group called DADS, Driver Alcohol Detection System for Safety. They've been working this problem too for years. Now, Pennsylvania could be at the forefront of demanding this technology. My suggestion would be to craft a requirement to your motor vehicle code that says any vehicle manufactured after, pick a year, 2025, has to be equipped with a passive impaired driver detection system which would render the vehicle inoperable or operable to a reduced capacity by a drunk or drugged person. It'll take about 20 years to purge the state of all the older cars, but you got to start someplace. These passive alcohol sensors are already in use by some police departments. That's all I've got.
Thank you, Chris. Chris.
Rich.
Rich, I'm sorry. Chris Demko, would you like to talk a little bit about your situation and what you...
Yeah, I'll try to keep it simple. When our daughter was killed by a repeat offender, we realized how common it is. I think most people don't realize it until it happens to you, but there's usually 300 people killed every year in the state of Pennsylvania. There's thousands of injuries, and about 40% of fatalities are tied to repeat offenders. After our daughter was killed, we realized how common this was. We then formed a group with about almost 30 families now from across the state of Pennsylvania, and about 44% of our group, our kids were killed by repeat offenders. Our group was really active with the last piece of legislation last session, and it was a big piece of legislation that I would sit there and say is primarily a penalty. But the problem is, it's a lot bigger than penalties. You're not going to put people away in jail forever. I think our position related to the penalties until the state figures out, and not just legislators, the state, the whole DUI industry, because it's really an industry, it's so big. The state needs to figure out how to handle treatment and how to handle the offenders on their first, their second, their third, where it's not just long jail time. And I think our focus this session or going forward is treatment. The state does a really poor job of managing treatment. They don't measure treatment, but yet treatment is a cornerstone of DUI legislation and of penalties. So from our perspective, that's where the state needs to go. There's some major legislation that is reforming criminal justice, and effectively they're going to have to rely on treatment. So I think the big issue that our group is focusing on is the need to improve the measurement of treatment, as well as making it a more effective outcome. So that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. We've just heard a whole list of suggestions dealing with parole, minimums, whether sentences should run concurrent or consecutive. We have some folks up here. We have Richie Neumann, who's the ED of the Transportation Committee, who was instrumental in the legislation that passed last year, and our DA, Kat Copeland. We have state police as well, and Greg Rowe from the District Attorneys Association. I'd just like to turn it over to you for comment. Feel free, whoever wants to jump in, is what you think, as we look to change the language and the treatment option. I mean, that's something we definitely need to be looking at, is what we're doing while we have them incarcerated. And then in this case, it seemed to me that once released, he didn't make one of the requirements that he should have made after being released. And we need a better system within probation and parole that they'll grab right back. If they're not going to meet the requirements, what got them the parole in the first place, get them right back into the system. So I'm going to now turn it over to the rest of the panel. Okay.
Thank you, Senator Killian. As the DeRosa and Ekman family talked about, there's some cold, hard facts. On February 16th of 2019, Dina was killed by a 5-time previously convicted DUI offender. She and her husband were driving home from their nephew's 3rd birthday party when David Strohauer, traveling at 69 miles per hour, veered into oncoming traffic, slamming his car into theirs. He fled the scene on foot, only to return and claim he had not been driving. The devastation he left behind, not only to the Ekman family and the DeRosa family, but to the community at large, is unimaginable. At age 30, this was his 6th DUI offense within 10 years. He was drunk with a BAC of 0.199%. In addition to alcohol, he had cocaine, marijuana, diazepam, commonly referred to as Valium, all in his system. He is what is referred to as a Tier 3 offender and was on state parole for 5 months at the time of this offense. For each one of his previous DUI offenses, he served the mandatory sentence required under the law. Each time he emerged from prison to reoffend. I'd like to thank the Senate Majority Policy Committee, including obviously Senator Killian, for our recently enacted laws that have significantly improved our DUI laws, particularly with respect to repeat offenders. The increased grading of a felony of a 3rd degree for a 4th-time DUI offender and for a 3rd-time person with a DUI conviction within 10 years with a BAC is 0.16 or higher. And also for our recently enacted homicide by vehicle while DUI, where if there's a prior DUI, the mandatory is set at 5 years. And where there was 2 or more previous DUIs, the mandatory is set at 7 years. DUIs are not harmless crimes. Most importantly, Every DUI driver, when they get behind the wheel of a car, they're potentially a homicide waiting to happen. There's an ongoing issue with respect to DUI offenders, that is, repeat DUI offenders. The penalty for a third-time DUI offender who is a Tier 3, that is, a BAC of 0.16 or higher or drugs in their system, is a mandatory of 1 year in jail. The penalty for Tier 3 offenders who are on their 4th offense, 5th offense, or like David Strauhauer on their 6th offense is the same, 1 year in jail. So what solutions can we suggest? These penalties need to be increased. We can expand the mandatory on Tier 3, 4th, or subsequent offenses from a 1 year to a 2 year or higher, and most importantly, with no RRI eligibility. RRI stands for Recidivism Risk Reduction Incentive. It's essentially good time credit in state prison. Why should these offenders get early release when they have, by definition, proven themselves incapable of not driving while under the influence? Tier 3 offenders with a 1 year mandatory has a RRI minimum of 9 months, meaning they get out after 9 months. Tier 3s are also, generally speaking, state intermediate punishment program eligible. Essentially, they can get treatment while in prison. And that ineligibility, any ineligibility can be waived by a prosecutor. Our experience has shown that state intermediate punishment is an incredibly effective program which provides treatment to offenders whose crimes are motivated by addiction to drugs and alcohol. Now, when the 4th and subsequent offenders come back into the system, they either rejected state intermediate punishment and didn't take advantages of the offers that made, or they did their time, or treatment for them has been ineffective. This increase of punishment both addresses the problem and narrowly focuses the solution. Solution suggested number 2 is to have the Sentencing Commission do a sentencing guideline enhancement for the new felony DUI convictions, that is, the 4th conviction or more, or the 3rd where the BAC is 0.16 or higher. Currently, these offenses are assigned under the sentencing guidelines an offense gravity score of 5. That means for an individual with no prior record, or prior record which doesn't actually count under the guidelines, their guidelines are restorative sanctions to 9 months in the standard range. To put this in perspective, a commercial burglary, a theft of $2,000 to $25,000, or 3rd or subsequent library theft are all assigned an offense gravity score of 5. An offense gravity score of 6 or higher would be more appropriate. Chris Demko described it best. What we should be asking, what does treatment look like in our jails? One of our goals is to reduce recidivism, to prevent people from repeatedly cycling in and cycling out of our criminal justice system. Simultaneously with the proposed increase in punishment, we need to address treatment for DUI offenders in prison and when they're released. I'd like to thank the senators here for having this committee meeting. I'd like to thank the Pennsylvania District Attorneys Association, particularly Director of Legislation Policy, Greg Rowe, who is always at the forefront of these kinds of issues, and for their wise guidance, and to Chris Demko and his family for their incredible bravery and efforts in changing the DUI law to what it is today. And of course, the DeRosa and Ekman family, who despite the tragedy that they have faced, are here sharing their stories through their grief and asking us to not let somebody else become a victim of these kinds of changes in the law, which are easily changed and easily acceptable. Thank you.
Thank you, Kat. We have with us Greg Rowe and Nolan Ritchie. Greg is with the District Attorneys Association and frequently in the Capitol helping us draft legislation. And Nolan Ritchie is the Executive Director of Transportation Committee who helps write the bills when we as legislators are looking to make the laws here in Pennsylvania better. I'd like to turn over to them and ask them for their comments, both to what the families had to say as well as what District Attorney Copeland had to say.
Thank you, Senator. And on behalf of the District Attorneys Association, we really appreciate being here and being able to provide input. Obviously, our condolences to the DeRosa family. And Chris Demko, it is always a privilege and an honor to work with you and to be at a forum with you. You know, one of the themes that we've heard here from pretty much every speaker thus far has been about the early DUIs, the first and second and third DUIs, about the theme of treatment. That's a really important theme here that I think we really need to, as we go forward, need to focus on and to talk about. And here's why. We hear this a lot, and this isn't just in the Capitol, this is just in everyday life. We often hear a line that's basically, it was just a DUI. He had one beer too many, he got home, he was fine. Nobody got hurt. We hear that. Thank God nobody got hurt, because that driver was impaired. And when we're talking about treatment on somebody who's done a first or a second, even when nobody's been hurt, they've been arrested, they've been convicted, they're not going to go into the state penitentiary. They might go to county jail, they'll do a short sentence, a few days, and get treatment. It's really important to keep in mind that if we don't provide that treatment, if we don't look at the quality of the treatment, if we don't fund the treatment, that second DUI is going to become a fourth DUI, which is going to become a fifth DUI, and someone's going to die. Now, not everybody can be treated. Not everybody's amenable to treatment. Not everybody wants treatment, but a lot of people are. So while in this case, I don't know what more robust treatment would have done for the Demko family, I don't know. But one of the lessons globally is when we hear the line of it was just a DUI, we got to speak up and we got to say no. Because a year from now, again, it'll be a fourth or a fifth. And it's an easy response to say, but to confront somebody with it, maybe a person who was that driver, who's a little glib about it, that's a little more confrontational. But to convince people, to convince lawmakers, to convince policymakers, to convince the general public, I think that has to become part of our parlance. So we all need to do that. It's hard to do. It's hard to confront people like that, but we really need to. One of the other themes is when Kat was talking about increasing the penalties, we're not talking about the need to build a new wing in our state prisons. We're not talking about increasing costs or having to raise people's taxes or having to bust open the budgets of the state parole board or county probation. Our goal here and what we're talking about is focusing on that small, thank God, small number of, we're not talking repeat offenders, we're talking about the repeat offenders who repeat and who have very high blood alcohol levels. And really as an initial matter, start focusing on them and upping the ante, because for some, the only appropriate sanction is incapacitation. Because for some, treatment is not going to work, or it's going to take a lot of time to work, and they're not going to get the message. And the only way to keep them from being behind the wheel, drunk, or high on drugs, or both, is to incapacitate them. Again, we don't think it's a hugely significant number, but it's too many. And the consequences of inaction are tragic and ultimately are deadly. So I think the points that Kat talked about, Senator Killian talked about, and others will, but focusing on this cohort of individuals will yield a lot of benefits, and I don't think will end up costing a lot. In fact, I think where there are costs associated is with better treatment. I've often said, I'm going to end with this here, but I've often said, as we look at criminal justice reform and improving the system, and we should, because the system can certainly be improved. Treatment is a huge component of that, but treatment costs money. Intervention costs money. You can't reform the system on the cheap. And that is so appropriate and on point here. It may require more counselors, more addiction counselors, and not just for alcohol, but for drugs and mental health, because they all go together. And if we're serious about this, if we want to make a real difference and do good treatment and evaluate it, it's going to cost some money. I'm not going to say where the money should come from. That's harder, but it's going to take an investment, and the investment will work out. It will yield great results. But without a serious and significant investment, we're kidding ourselves. And I know we can do that. We've got great people at the table here. I know you're here, so you're invested in making a change. But any solution that does not require more dollars, better use of dollars, and more effort, and everyone looking at themselves and what they do, and admitting some things that collectively we haven't done as well as we can, and what we can do better, then we're kidding ourselves. But I think we can do that. But it's going to be challenging. But I think we can do that. No?
Sure. Thank you. Well, my thoughts and prayers are with the families who have lost a loved one. This is definitely never an easy issue that we deal with in the legislature. And I want to echo Senator Killian's comments. My role is to help usher legislation through the challenging, complex legislative process. And I know I have become close friends with Chris Demko, unfortunately through this situation, but he recognizes the challenge of getting significant DUI legislation passed. And I'll speak a little bit to that because we have seen some significant accomplishments within the legislature within the last couple of years, most notably with Act 153, which finally created a felony DUI in Pennsylvania. And we never had a felony DUI before in this state. So that was a significant milestone that we were able to accomplish together, and also increasing the mandatory minimums for homicide by vehicle. But this is not easy in the legislative process, and this requires time, effort, one-on-one press conferences, so forth and so on. There is a lot that goes on in the Capitol on a daily basis in legislative season, but at the same time, there are very important issues that we must address and prioritize. And working with the senators, which is my responsibility to work with them when they set the policy, I help to provide good guidance in developing that legislation to ensure that also is adhering to federal state standards as well. And I bring that point up because we have to also be cognizant that the federal system, through the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, for example, they also have different parameters that we must adhere to. So that's something important that working through this process, we'll have to understand where we are as a state in comparison with other states. That is something we continuously work on as well, making sure that our DUI laws are stronger than other states, and looking at some other aspects such as license suspensions. I think we have definitely seen that suspending a person's license does not automatically deter them from driving. So we need to be smarter at what we are trying to accomplish through the legislative process. And the ignition interlock law, which was another significant piece of legislation that we passed in the General Assembly a few years ago, that was also, again, another uphill battle. And for me, working on this legislation, it's hard for me sometimes to understand why this is such a challenge, getting our laws to be stronger. And it is unfortunately a process that does take time, but I'm really, really excited when I see members like Senator Killian, like Senator Argyle, who stand up for these issues and become champions of these issues. And that's what we need to get some more stronger laws for DUIs. Thank you.
Thank you, Nolan. Debbie, would you like to comment? You've been involved in these issues for a while.
Yes, thank you. First of all, Senator Argyle, Senator Killian, thank you for the invitation to be here today. It's sad that it took the tragic events of February 16th, which resulted in Dean Ekman being killed, to bring us here to discuss the complexities of the repeat DUI offenders. I want to personally thank the DeRosa family, Roseanne, Rich, and Chris, Dina's husband, for their bravery and courage to be up here today and to share this personal story, which really dealt with the worst day of their life. And their motivation to do so is to really spare people in the future, to save someone or spare another family of having to go through the pain. I've provided the people up here on the panel with a packet, and it has some statistics, but for the benefit of those who don't have that, I just want to review some of it. Now, some of these are national statistics. Drunk driving claimed the lives of almost 11,000 people in the years 2016 and 2017, according to NHTSA, showing that drunk driving remains the leading cause of death nationwide on the roads today. On average, 2 in 3 people will be involved in a drunk driving crash in their lifetime. Every 2 minutes, a person is injured in a drunk driving crash. So if you look at your watch, think about the time that we've been here today and think about how many people have already been affected. Every day in America, another 27 people die because of drunk driving crashes. 50 to 75% of convicted drivers continue to drive on a suspended license. And I know some comments today reference that. I think that is important. Just because someone has been charged and they have a suspended license, similar to David Strohauer, does not mean that they're not going to get behind the wheel of that car. An average drunk driver has driven drunk more than 80 times before their first arrest. 25 to 30% of drivers with a BAC of 0.08 and above who were involved in fatal crashes are repeat DUI offenders. A lot of times, the repeat DUI offenders are referred to as hardcore. NHTSA estimates that approximately 1/3 of the 1.5 million drunk driving arrests each year involve the repeat DUI offenders. I don't think there's any disagreement with the statistics. And based on the comments that have been shared so far, I think the stats are accepted, and I don't think there's any dispute. The question really is what can be done. I think what Rich DeRosa shared with us regarding the technology will ultimately be what solves this situation that we're dealing with. I don't think we can afford to wait. I don't know how other people feel. I think the DAD system is hopeful, but if you look 20 to 25 years down the road, I think we would be foolish to wait. I agree with everybody that it has to be a kind of a multi-pronged approach. I think we need changes in our legislation. I think Roseanne mentioned the weapon enhancement, which is something that the state of Texas has to really treat a vehicle as a weapon, because clearly it is. Who wants to be on the receiving end of that? I think what Kat mentioned in terms of changing the penalties, I think all of those changes are good. And I think I'm going to maybe say it a little differently, Nolan, but Pennsylvania really has just incorporated new legislation, and it was an uphill battle. So I think it's fair to say what is the appetite out there for future changes as we try to push this through. I think that enforcement of DUI laws is important, and I think that's all types of enforcement. It's not just with the police officers who do the initial arrest. I think we really need to look at the judicial enforcement. Why are there so many pleas out there? Why, as Rich said, are sentences running consecutive versus concurrently? I think that we would be remiss not to really talk about, and I'm going to just call them enablers. I think there's probably better terms out there. How about these people that are allowing people with suspended sentences to drive their cars? I don't understand that. There is rarely a criminal charge, if any, when that occurs. Pennsylvania is ranked, it's changed because of the recent law changes and the felony laws, which, again, PA Page should be commended for the hard work they did to get those laws passed. Pennsylvania is ranked 43rd in the nation. That doesn't make me feel good. I would like to see our penalties and sentences be much stricter, and I think we seriously need a change, and we really need to ask ourselves, living in this state, what do Pennsylvanians value? You know, is this an acceptable way to respond to the DUI situation? I think along with legislative changes and enforcement, I think there needs to be monitoring. And there has been a lot of success with what I will call the SCRAM bracelet, which is the secure, continuous, remote alcohol monitoring. Different counties within the state have used it very effectively. It's different than an ignition interlock, okay? Because if someone is issued a SCRAM bracelet, as soon as they ingest alcohol, the monitor goes off and they are picked up as a violation. And different counties use it differently. This is to my knowledge, but sometimes it's once someone was arrested for a DUI, they're issued a SCRAM. Sometimes it's used on the probation or parole end. So there's different ways to use it, but I myself, driving the roads, would feel much safer to know that someone, whether they're out on parole, whether they've just been arrested, that they are actually, if they ingest alcohol, that they would be picked up sooner. Another form of monitoring, I think, is DUI courts. I think that there's a benefit to counties that run DUI courts. It's a consistent judge, it's a consistent prosecutor, and it also expedites how quickly someone moves through the process, which I think is important. And they meet more frequently. They come back before the judge and to check and see how they're doing. It's kind of what they call a problem-solving court. They do it often for drugs. They do it often for mental health. As I said, some counties do it for alcohol, and I think that there's value to considering it in the future. And then, as everyone is agreed, you're not going to touch the hardcore offenders unless there's court-mandated treatment. And again, the DUI court could monitor that. But what I want to really emphasize today, we're speaking specifically about Dina Ekman and David Strohauer. There's a lot, I sit in courtrooms across the state. There's a lot of other David Strohauers out there. I don't think anyone should fool themselves for 1 minute that this is not a more common occurrence. There's actually a gentleman now who's sitting in prison. It's a Delaware County case, and he's an 8-time DUI offender. His first DUI arrest was back in 1999. His very first charge was homicide by vehicle while DUI, okay? His most recent charge was in August of 2018. He was arrested. He was on parole. He was released that night. He was an 8-time convicted DUI offender. He was picked up, regardless of having a history of absconding and having to have bench warrants issued. He was released, and to no one's surprise, he did not show up for his next meeting with his probation officer. And his license is suspended until the year 2046. So whenever his case is fully adjudicated, his next court event is in June, and whenever he serves the term of whatever that sentence will be, since it was August of 2018, it will not be classified as a felony. He will be classified as a habitual offender. Again, I would feel safer knowing that he's going to be on a SCRAM bracelet, so that if he does ingest alcohol, that we would know immediately. So again, thank you for the opportunity today.
Thank you, Debbie. Lieutenant Hannigan, do you, as someone who's at the state police that are on the streets, do you have any comments?
Yes, thank you, Senator. I want to thank the senators for holding this discussion and for inviting the state police to be represented. And I also want to thank the DeRosa and Ekman families and all the other families who continue to speak out. I can only imagine how difficult that is to continually share the story, but it is very important work that you're doing, and I really commend you for that. I will say that as a law enforcement professional, from our perspective, I could speak more on the enforcement aspect and what our troopers on the road are seeing on a daily basis. We have seen, just anecdotally, as evidenced by David Strohauer, mixed toxicity when it comes to driving under the influence. Not only alcohol, but more along the lines of all different sorts of drugs that are in people's systems when they're driving, whether it be heroin, fentanyl, marijuana. We've had numerous incidents recently with people being under the influence of synthetic marijuana from the vape pens that they're smoking, and these are causing not only driving under the influence, but psychotic episodes where people are driving in really psychotic states that is really difficult for our troopers to manage when they have to arrest these people. It's becoming more and more dangerous. It's becoming more and more not only difficult to enforce, difficult to detect. So with the state police, we have been implementing many different programs, many different training for our troopers with regards to drug recognition. We have our DREs, which are drug recognition experts, who are specially trained to detect people driving under the influence of not only alcohol, but different substances, because all of these substances cause people to act in a different manner. And it's not always only alcohol. A lot of times we see a combination of things. We are training our troopers on a daily basis when they're from the academy and even after to be cognizant of this fact and to be able to recognize all the different kinds of impairment that we're seeing on a daily basis. Just to speak on behalf of the state police of what we are seeing, I appreciate that opportunity this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Lieutenant. Question for Kat. Have we, the scram bracelets, that's something new to me. Have we looked at that in the county at all, do you know?
We have not dealt with that in the county, actually. That I'm hearing about it. I think that's something that, thank you. That's something that we'll actually look into on our end. We are familiar with the Rudd DUI that you're mentioning, and some of the pitfalls that exist, and the issues with respect to the fact that our police officers, like Lieutenant mentioned, are oftentimes, their hands are tied by the laws about when they can actually release people and when they must release people. And the fact that they oftentimes have to wait till the blood alcohol results are back before charging them in certain instances. And that's how people like Mr. Rudd managed to be released on an evening after being arrested for DUI. The scram basis is one of the things that we're actually looking at right now.
Yeah, I think that'd be very worthwhile. Is that something we could mandate legislatively?
I think Chris might be able to speak to this.
Yeah, a couple things. There's a couple counties, I'm sure there's more, I just know of two, York County and Lancaster County. They both use scram pre-sentencing. They usually do it for repeat offenders. York has a central booking location, and they move them right to a scram. Lancaster does it probably within a week. It's called drop in Lancaster. York calls Target 25. Additionally, there is a bill that was recently introduced in Representative Stevens, I think, introduced it, and it would require scram bracelet as a condition for bail. And Nolan, I don't know if you know anything about that bill. It was probably introduced about 3 weeks ago. I was told it may be going to a hearing this week.
Well, I can follow up with Todd Stevens and get a copy of that bill to see if we can maybe do something similarly in the Senate. It sounds like a good idea. Yeah. Local guy, Montgomery County rep, good friend. Is there anybody else want to jump in? Go ahead.
This might be one of the most disturbing public meetings I've ever attended. I'm 60 years old. I remember when we first began to take the DUI issue, very seriously, and we greatly increased the penalties and the enforcement. And I just marvel at the bravery at this panel. I don't know that my wife and I get upset just thinking about it, and you've lived this. In my experience in the House and the Senate, and I've served with Tommy a long time in both chambers, I've learned that if we attempt to go at the whole loaf, we may not succeed, but if we do it slice by slice by slice incrementally, and what I'm hearing, I think the suggestion here today was to really go after the worst of the worst. And I can't imagine, anyone objecting to that kind of legislation, and that's the role of this committee. Once the bill is drafted and the research is done, it goes to Nolan and his boss and the other staff on the Transportation Committee. We're the advanced scouts, if you will, in doing the research. And I'm curious, Mr. Strohauer, where is he today? Okay. And okay.
Yeah, he's currently incarcerated. He's waiting trial. He just had a preliminary hearing last month or so.
In terms of legal options, and I went to college for a long time after my undergraduate days, but not one day of law school, so I'm venturing into an area here without a lot of expertise. What are the possibilities for what can happen to him, assuming he's proven guilty?
He is looking at mandatory minimum sentences thanks to the recently enacted DUI laws with respect to the homicide by vehicle while DUI. More importantly, because of the fact that he had actually received educational treatment about the consequences of DUI, we were able to charge him with third-degree murder, and therefore he faces the consequences should he be convicted of that.
And what are the penalties there?
He faces up to 40 years in jail.
Okay. Very different from what he's seen in the past.
Very much so.
And the other thing, I guess, and I'll work with your senator on changing the law. The enforcement of the law is, of course, critical, and I think the education. I represent about 250,000 people between Reading and Hazleton, a lot of little towns, and I think on my e-newsletter in the next couple weeks, you'd mentioned about it's not just a DUI. I mean, that's a headline that we all should think about. I have to think a fair number of my constituents probably think that, yeah, the worst thing that can happen with a DUI is a ticket.
You can show it.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Tom.
Thank you, David. There, a couple things. I agree with David that, when we move legislation, I mean, it's all basic math. We have to get 26 votes in the Senate, 102 votes in the House, and then get the governor to sign the bill. And so sometimes a narrower focus is better. What I heard here today, I think, and I heard it from Greg Rowe and others, is that this smaller population of repeat offenders with high blood alcohol levels should be a priority as far as increasing the penalties, making sure they stay in prison so they can't come out and reoffend again and cause tragedy like this, but also on the education side. I think we need to work with, and I don't know if this is a legislative function or it's just working with the administration, is to educate our parole board and those involved in that system that a DUI isn't just a DUI, especially when you get in these 3, 4, 5 time, as we heard, was they let him out, and then he was able to go and consume alcohol, cause a tragedy, and that gets back to why I like this scram bracelet. And the minute he had a drop, then maybe the state police could, or local municipal police could grab him and put him back as a parole violator. So we have a lot of work to do, and that was the purpose of today. As myself and my staff, working along with Nolan and the experts in the Transportation Committee, draft a final bill that we can submit. We've already put a co-sponsorship memo out without language, which is kind of unheard of. I already have 8 co-sponsors on this bill out of the 50 senators without any hard work being done other than letting the memo out and talking one-on-one, obviously, with some of my colleagues. But we have a lot of work ahead of us. I am going to be counting on the families, which I know I can, to help us in this effort as we educate the other senators as to why the importance of this, so that we can make sure this just simply doesn't happen again. And we have some folks that have already been down this road legislatively and how you move a bill forward that we'll also be calling on to help. With that, I'll see if there's any other comments to the panel. Yes, Tracy.
I guess my question goes to Nolan. From an enforcement standpoint, the consecutive versus the concurrent, is it not true that the judges have the discretion to determine that?
They do.
That's the problem.
I would probably defer that to the court system. And I know that we had taken legislative action recently as well, that if there was a conviction, that we were looking to ensure that if the person was pending sentencing and they were receiving another DUI for that same situation, that it was all being considered at the same time and not waiting for that next court date. But I'll defer to the courts, maybe help explain that a little bit better.
So yes, you're correct. Right now, as it stands, it is not required that it be run consecutive, and the court can determine as to whether or not they are run concurrent or whether or not they are run consecutive.
Okay.
I have a question. If there's someone, the third DUI, and all of the charges have been a high rate of blood alcohol, reckless driving, there should be a law where you cannot have it run concurrent. It should be run consecutive. Because what happens is they make a plea deal, the judge agrees to it, and there it is, it's concurrent. It's like a no-brainer to them because they're just sitting there in a courtroom and it's just normal. That has to be changed because if it had been run consecutive, he still would have been in jail.
I agree with you. I think it would help to have, each sentence should have its own sense of gravitas. And when these kinds of sentences are run concurrent to one another, it meant that he got away with it.
He did.
Absolutely. So what you're saying completely makes sense. The second aspect of that is that that has always been an issue that has been ongoing. So a change in the law, making it mandatory that they run consecutive, would give a bite to it. Having said that, when he got out of jail, maybe another 8 months down the road,
He would have done it again.
right?
Because he went through all the rehabilitation and it meant nothing. And his father basically gave him the tools to commit this crime. So there's nobody held accountable for whoever hands you the keys to the car. If one of my children were charged with a DUI, I guarantee you they wouldn't be driving for a really long time. But his father continually helped him, enabled him he gave him a vehicle. He didn't care when he saw his son drunk all the time. And other people have to be held accountable. Bar owners are held accountable. If someone leaves their bar and they're drunk, they go after the bar owner. His father knowingly watched him that day drink heavily. His brother did. And they let him, and they said, well, we couldn't stop him. Call 911, take his keys away, drag him out of the truck. There's a million things that could have been done to prevent this. But nobody could step up to it. Nobody wants to address it.
It's a great point. It's a lesson for our public to be aware of. There are so very many options for people to take in terms of what things that they can do to stop people from becoming a DUI offender.
On the concurrent versus consecutive, Greg, Nolan, has there been any legislation? And Greg, from your perspective as someone who lobbies on these issues for the DA Association, how heavy of a lift would that be?
There was a totally unrelated bill. It was a bill in the House. I think it was Tony DeLuca's bill on certain repeat violent offenders, crimes with firearms. And he's had a bill for many sessions that, and I think Rick Saccone picked it up at one point too, which would have required a consecutive sentence when you had multiple violent crimes being committed as part of the same criminal episode. A few years ago, it did pass the House, and then it didn't move past the Senate Judiciary Committee, all under prior leadership in both the House and Senate Judiciary Committees. Yeah, it's a heavy lift. The criticism of it is you're infringing on judicial discretion. So it's an argument similar to that which you hear for those who oppose mandatory minimum sentences. But I think that idea, the criticism goes a step further in that with consecutive versus concurrent, it's either A or B. And in this case, you cross out A, being concurrent, so it has to be consecutive. Whereas a mandatory minimum sentence is a floor, and the judge still has some discretion to go up. So, look, if that's what we want to do, I know our association thinks that would be a very appropriate way to move forward as part of the overall package. But I don't think we should at all conclude that it would be easy or simple or uncontroversial by any means. If I could just add one point, I thought your point about with regard to the parole board and hearing examiners, and as we're looking to educate people, you know, it's important to educate those who are making some really important decisions, because I think all of us at different times have to be educated and re-educated about all areas of public policy, even the areas that we work in. We can't forget about actors on the county level. So county probation, county parole, I think is just, it's a detail, but it's an important group to bring into any efforts that we do as well, since so many of the smaller crimes obviously begin at the county level and then kind of escalate up. Let's just always try to, you know, make sure we include those stakeholders as well.
Thank you. Are there any other comments from anyone?
Yeah, and I appreciate your concept of keeping it small, because how hard we've all learned legislation can be. But the one thing I'd say on treatment, you know, we're all in favor of the penalties, but we also know that penalties are only good for so long, and eventually, unless we're going to commit people to life, they're going to get out and they're still going to have their problem. We do believe treatment is a solution, but I'd say the state really needs to do a few things. I know recently I pulled some data from PennDOT, who's responsible for reporting on various DUI data. And what we've seen is, over the past 4 years, the measurement for successful treatment for people that are mandated to have treatment for DUI is only 13%. Now, you will talk to some experts that say, well, that data can't be right, but the reality of it is that is the only data available to determine if treatment is successful at the state level. And you either say the data is bad, or if the data is good, it means treatment's failing. And the other thing I'd say is there is no accountability for treatment providers in the state of Pennsylvania. There was a recent case up in Bucks County, Liberations. They created a massive fraud. They were shut down, and they were basically running people through drug treatment for the money. And then you go to look into it, and the state just doesn't have the appropriate oversight. So if we're going to look at treatment, and I would sit there and say treatment's critical, the state needs to do a better job of data, and it needs to do a better job of monitoring treatment providers, because there's no accountability. There's no measurement of saying this provider does a good job, this provider does a horrible job. There's no way to measure that. So, you know, if we're going to be serious about treatment, and I think it's a big issue in the state, my recommendation is start focusing on treatment, start focusing on data, and require the providers to report. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Just one other. You know, we're hearing about, it's much similar to our opioid crisis. we're struggling with an epidemic. And hearing about the family and the accessibility of the vehicle, tough love is huge in the opioid crisis and any type of addiction. And the accessibility, their family situation, they are permanently scarred by the lack of consistency from the Strohauer family by not giving the accessibility of the vehicle. It's a family struggle when you deal with addiction, but this has crossed over. What is the accountability for the Strohauer family knowingly allowing them to use the vehicle? Is there any accountability on the books for that?
I can speak for a family in our group. Their son was killed by a 7-time DUI offender in Chester County. It was about 5 years ago. The Crawleys, I don't know if anybody knows the story. There was really nothing in the statute to go against the parent who provided the vehicle, but they civilly sued them and won for actually a really big judgment, and I think at some point we can talk about it. So there's nothing I understand from a statute standpoint. There may be like a $25 fine. It's like ridiculously low. So I would sit there and say, that is something. The individual that killed our daughter, he was driving his mother's car. It's just another story like that. So.
You would hope that fear, knowing that there would be accountability from a criminal standpoint, would deter families.
I don't think it does.
David?
Are we finished now?
Yeah, I think
I just want to thank Tom for bringing us all together. I look forward to working with him to address this issue sooner rather than later. And I look forward to seeing the folks here in the room at the bill signing ceremony when we're sitting next to the governor.
Thank you, everyone.